What is black and white and red all over? A newspaper. After that banger of a joke, it's now time for me to explain why newspapers are still relevant. According to Google, a newspaper is a printed publication, usually issued daily or weekly, consisting of folded, unstapled sheets and containing news, feature articles, advertisements, and correspondence. While most people would agree with that definition, it feels slightly outdated to me. In my opinion, the more accurate definition of a newspaper is the Wikipedia one, which describes a newspaper as a periodical publication containing written information about current events and is often typed in black ink with a white or gray background. With the prevalence of newspapers and their articles being published and accessed online, it would not be fair or accurate to consider newspapers to only be of paper rather than something that started out as only paper but has since evolved into other formats. While a version of newspapers was around before then, they began to prosper in the 1690s in big cities like London, Boston, and Philadelphia. Since then, they have grown and changed into what we now recognize as newspapers. With all this evolution, it begs the question, are newspapers still relevant today? The answer is yes, but before I explain that, I need to go over what makes a newspaper relevant. According to Kim Christian Schroeder, author of What Do News Readers Really Want to Read About? How Relevance Works for News Audiences, he writes, personal relevance is an indispensable gatekeeper of engagement with the news story. He is right and then goes on to include a chart in his paper about the factors that drive and define news relevance. This includes what brand it is, previous knowledge, sociability, proximity, and news story topic. I think that sums up why individual people find newspapers relevant to their lives, and even some on a societal level. With that, I think that something is relevant if it is able to fulfill a role and evolve with the times as necessary. In this essay, I will prove that newspapers fulfill the role of an agenda setter, act as a reliable source of information, and have kept up with the growing technology movement, which is how they have managed to stay relevant to our lives on a societal level and on an individual level. The public agenda. Newspapers set the public agenda. They decide what is important enough to cover. The things that do not get written about are very unlikely to gain a lot of public notice, while the things that are covered are more likely to be discussed and talked about. Even if no one reads the actual newspapers or articles, the titles are meant to sensationalize the concepts in a way that grab people's attention. A lot of the biggest newspaper companies like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post do this. At the end of the day, they are businesses. Maxwell McCombs and Donald Shaw, the two founding fathers of empirical research on the agenda-setting function of the press, wrote a paper discussing this phenomenon titled The Agenda-Setting Role of Mass Media in the Shaping of Public Opinion. Within it, they write about how newspapers provide a host of cues about the salience of topics in the daily news. Lead stories on page 1, other front page display, large headlines, etc. This is an important point to bring up because not only what is covered and what is not covered can affect how people read the newspaper, but even the placematting and formatting of it can mentally affect people's opinions. In this same paper, they discussed how social scientists frequently calculate the correlation between the ranking of the issues on the media agenda and the ranking according to those same issues on the subsequent public agenda. The vast majority of comparisons between how issues are ranked yield correlations of plus 0.5 or better. This means there's a large correlation between these two things. But Maya, why is this important in knowing how newspapers are relevant? Is what you may be thinking right now. It is important because newspapers are currently and are always going to be relevant because they set the agenda for what is important. They are important because the statistics show that people place importance in them to tell them about the world. It is impossible for people to always know what is going on in the world without newspapers. So newspapers will always be relevant because they are a source of information to find out what is happening. Fake news. Fake news has always been a problem, but it has become more of a steadily growing issue since social media was created in the late 90s. Sarah Fisher, a Washington, D.C. media reporter, posted a chart documenting this trend. While in 1 year the amount of credible resources grew by 59%, the amount of unreliable sources grew by 400%. Social media provides a way for people to tell their own experiences, thoughts, and opinions. While there is value to that, it is not a reliable source of current events or news. And due to how accessible it is to publish now with only the click of a finger, things like fact-checking have fallen to the wayside. Fake news is often spread because of this. In an article from CPR.com, it states that according to the 2019 Duke University Reporters Lab census, 44 fact-checking organizations existed 5 years ago. There are 195 now. Angie Holland also states that the new age of fact-checking may therefore be interpreted as journalism adapting to the needs of its digital environment. As if to combat this influx of fake news, newspaper companies are trying their best to be reliable for readers. This is what is happening right now. Fake news, fake news, fake news. Newspapers. Newspapers are relevant because they provide a reliable source of information that cannot be gotten in other places. Social media does provide a flow of information, but it's much easier to lie about facts in a way that could easily be caught if it was put through the editing process of newspapers.
If I said that newspapers are still relevant, what is your opinion on that?
I think that newspapers will always be relevant. Newspapers, as a history teacher, are something that capture history and save it forever.
Accessibility. Accessibility is more important than ever right now. In such a connected landscape, it is important for everyone to have access to reputable newspapers to keep up with current events and the state of how things are doing. This was not a big concern in the 1690s, with there being high rates of illiteracy and the process of making newspapers being so long. Since then, not only are newspapers and their contents easier than ever to find, but they also come in many different formats. The main ways that people think about newspapers are digitally and on paper, with the former relatively new. But even then, there are also other ways to access newspapers, like with Braille, which is often an underlooked format of newspapers. Metro newspaper launched its first Braille front page on a national newspaper this past December. The National Federation of the Blind has a free audio service for anyone blind, low vision, deafblind, or otherwise print disabled. According to one anonymous person, NFB Newsline reopened the world of newspapers and magazines to me. Thank you for enabling me to read periodicals from all over the nation and world cities. It makes me feel more included and informed. Only digital newspapers are not feasible for people who cannot read on devices. This can include senior citizen whose eyes hurt from the brightness or blue light emitting from the screen. According to Press Gazette, about 50% of the UK newspaper population is over 55 plus years old. This is the largest category, and that is the result of senior citizens reading the print newspaper. What works for one person who needs and has accommodations does not work for everyone. So NFB Newsline may work for senior citizens, but the Metro newspaper wouldn't, and that would be okay, because there are options. Newspapers have stayed relevant because they have options that account for the preferences and disabilities of all different people. While there is progress that needs to be made, the newspaper industry has grown exponentially in the past 20 years alone with the technologies and options that it can offer people. In conclusion, newspapers are still relevant because they are a culturally important, reliable source of information, and it has evolved to offer more options to those who need it. It is of a contemporary interest to everyone that newspapers continue in our society.
Do you think newspapers are still relevant? 100%. I think for people who don't have access to technology or the time being that when phones break, I think it's a great way to cement everything.